Hello there everybody and welcome to this channel. My name is Savvy from SAanatomy.com, and for this video we're going to be working on a frog. So get your drawing pads ready or whatever you're using to work on your 3D models, and let's get started. So as you can see here, I've already worked on the 3D model of the frog. I tried to get the best topology as possible. Perhaps in a separate video I can show you how I modeled the frog. 3D modeling your character or your creature helps you understand the forms of the model and where the details are supposed to go. Say for example, you wanted to model this frog or a male character or female character, you would understand that the muscles are supposed to flow in this certain direction, so you would model it in that way so that when you start sculpting, it's a lot easier for you to sculpt. And as always, as I've mentioned many times before in previous videos, before working on your sculpt or whilst you're working on your sculpt, you need to focus on your form hierarchy. That being your primary, secondary, and tertiary forms. With your primary forms being the main shape of the model, the silhouette, your broader volumes. Your secondary forms being the medium-sized shapes that sit on top of the primary forms. That adds on to the primary forms that helps with direction and the anatomy or the definition. And then lastly, your tertiary forms being the details, your pore details or your skin details or your veins and wrinkles and so on. So as you can see here for the frog, I'm just blocking out the primary shapes, just playing around a little bit, seeing what works, and also just correcting some errors from the 3D modeling side. Errors such as very tight spaces or pinched spaces on the 3D model, so I'm just smoothing those over, and I'm using the clay brush or the clay buildup brush to kind of add a little more details here and there. What you'll notice me doing sometimes is using the clay brush to just make like very strange shapes, and then I'll smooth it over. That's my quickest way of adding that rough detail to the model. So like I've mentioned before in previous videos, what I like to do for these sculpts, these animal sculpts, I like to actually sculpt the animal, what it would look like with skin and all the muscles underneath, and then I start breaking it down piece by piece. You don't have to go into great detail with that method, you just have to focus on the primary and secondary forms. This has helped me understand how the muscles look underneath, how they might move, and what the end results would look like of my sculpt. I sort of entered a flow state when working on the pectorals and the rectus abdominis. I first started by blocking everything out with the clay brush, smoothing it over, then using the crease brush to bring those details back out again. I mainly focus on the major shapes. I totally ignored the linea alba details, and I just focus on the rectus abdominis. When using the crease brush and working on the rectus abdominis, detailing the rectus abdominis, I disabled symmetry because I know that each side has its own details, it has its own different shapes. They're not too different, but if you look closely, you do notice the difference. What you can do after using the crease brush, I tend to do this sometimes, I usually do it at the end of the sculpt, but you can add a little more volume where the crease is by using the inflate brush. So just with a small strength on the inflate brush, you can just actually graze over the crease details and it'll bump it up just a little bit. When adding bones or detailing bones, what I like to do is using the clay buildup or a standard brush and using the flattened brush to actually give you that fine bony details. For the legs, I started off by using the crease brush and kind of drawing out where the major muscles would be, such as the gastrocnemius, the triceps femoris, and biceps femoris. What you can also see whilst I'm working here is I'm constantly moving the main body. I'm using the move brush and I'm just nudging certain things around. I'm just moving it around a little bit, trying to actually get the silhouette correct. And you shouldn't be afraid to move things around. Nudge them until they kind of look okay or they look correct. The silhouette actually reads. You're able to see what it is from afar. Just like the legs, I did the exact same thing on the arm. I drew out the major muscles that I know that you're going to be able to see, the deltoids, the triceps brachii, and so on. And the same thing goes here for the latissimus dorsi and the dorsalis scapulae. For this opening here at the back of the frog's head, I honestly should have done this detail in the 3D modeling side of things, because once you're sculpting, you can see there's like some small artifacts. It's almost like the model itself is breaking, so your quads are just not really moving the way that you want them to move. So I should have done this in the 3D modeling side, but I tried my best to fix it in the sculpting side. The good thing about this already having good enough topology is that after sculpting, I can, rather than me retopologizing the entire model, I can only fix certain sections of the model, which saves a lot of time. Now, if you notice in the sculpt, I'm still on the third level of detail on the multi-res modifier. So I can still go up and focus on the tertiary forms, but right now I'm just working on the primary and secondary forms, just trying to get them as close to perfect as possible. Now and then, when working on your sculpts, you'll actually find yourself jumping between your lower details and your higher details, but that's usually when the model or the sculpt is really close to being finished. So you're just mainly jumping in between doing some small touch-ups, so jumping back into the primary forms and just changing up the silhouette a little bit, not too extremely, and then going back into your tertiary forms, fixing up those changes or sculpting over those changes you've just done in the primary forms. For that line detail you get on your muscles, like that pattern that you usually get on your muscles, I just like to use my clay brush. I don't really use the crease brush and start drawing each individual line. I just use the clay brush and then just keep drawing back and forth, up and down, like hatching over it. And usually that works, but you can, for more detailed sculpts, more realistic looking sculpts, you might want to use the crease brush and actually draw in those individual lines or those patterns. Or you could make your own custom brush or use custom brushes to get that detail. So now, as you can see, I'm on the fourth layer, the fourth detail layer on the multi-resolution modifier. I still consider this my primary to secondary phase, so we're not really there at our tertiary phase yet. But you will see me jump in between. Like I've said before, I will be jumping back and forth between each level. I rarely go down to the first level. I usually stick around 2 or 3 and then I go up to 6. I don't think I'm necessarily too strict with myself when it comes to focusing on the form hierarchy or when I'm doing these sculpts. But I think it's just because I'm already used to this workflow. I'm already used to working on these sculpts. I'm already used to kind of just shutting off and working on these sculpts, kind of like just drifting away and focusing on like all the details and looking at the references, of course, but just kind of entering a flow state. There have been sculpts and 3D models I have worked on where I have been extremely strict on these rules. I've been extremely strict on myself, and I have focused on the form hierarchy and the topology of the model, and I've made sure that I got it as close to perfect as possible. But I do highly recommend just making sure that you don't have to be that strict with yourself, but you do have to pull yourself back when you feel yourself kind of forgetting the principles or the main rules that you're supposed to be following each time you work on these sculpts. When using the crease brush and working on these fine lines that stretch pretty far, it's best to use the stabilized stroke option in Blender. I believe in ZBrush it would be called the lazy stroke. The stabilized stroke option in Blender is at the top toolbar in the stroke panel, and you'll navigate your way down and find stabilized stroke, and you just enable that. And you use it. It will make your lines a lot smoother. It will make using crease brush a lot easier. Now at this point, I just wanted to rough out those muscle patterns that we spoke about earlier. So with just the simple clay brush, I'm just going in and drawing in those patterns piece by piece for each separate muscle. The patterns on each muscle group tend to have a single direction that they tend to follow. So you won't really find many muscle groups that veer off into different directions. It won't just go down and then left and right. Usually in that case, it just means that there's another muscle underneath or something else. So with my clay brush, I'm drawing in those patterns, smoothing them out just for that bumpy detail, and then drawing them in again. When working on your sculpts, it's also good to zoom out a little bit and see it in full, just so that you don't get tunnel vision whilst working on your sculpts. It's also good to actually black out the model itself and just look at the silhouette, make sure that it reads, make sure that you're able to tell what it is from afar or from certain angles. This is even more important when you're working on characters with items on them, swords, an entire armor set. You need to make sure that everything reads on the silhouette side. When I was working on this sculpt, I got into the tertiary phase pretty early, but I believe that's mainly because the primary forms and the secondary forms are good enough for me to move on and start detailing. And sometimes that will be the case. You will find yourself in a situation where you finished a model a lot quicker than you expected, or maybe everything just kind of worked perfectly. You didn't really have many hiccups. That doesn't necessarily mean that the model is completely done. Sometimes I do like revisiting certain models, see what I can improve, see what I can change, and continue researching. The hands for this sculpt were actually the trickiest parts, and that was mainly for me. That was mainly because they were a lot smaller in volume than the legs. The legs were just bigger, a lot bigger than the arms or the hands. For the finer muscular details like this on the legs, for example, on this part of the leg, I just did it all in the highest level of detail in the multi-resolution modifier, but I do recommend going back to a lower level, such as 4 maybe, and then drawing those muscle forms out, and then detailing them. For the webbed feet of the frog, it is good that I modeled it out like that initially, rather than me having to try and do it in the sculpting phase. Big parts of the silhouette or big changes in the silhouette, mainly I like to do it in the modeling side or in the primary forms of sculpting, so that I don't encounter many issues when working on these certain sections. For example, if I had to do it via just sculpting, I would probably have to stretch everything out first with the move tool or the move brush, and then inflate the parts where the phalanges are, or the toes or the fingers, or whatever you're working on. If it's a webbed kind of model part or model piece just like this one, then I would have to go in with my clay brush and detail the different sections of the fingers, and that would have been a lot more work just to get this kind of detail. So instead I just did it in the modeling phase. Also, when working with very tight model pieces or sections in the model, such as here with the webbed area, where the front face is very close to the back face. What usually happens with most of your brushes is they will actually start drawing on the back side as well. So each time you add a bump, or you draw, or you start sculpting on the front face, you'll actually see at the back side it's actually also caving in. So there are options you can check just to disable that. Then the other way you can do it is to just inflate it just a little bit and start sculpting on one side. Initially, when I was working on this, I did struggle to get references for certain parts of the frog's body. What you can also do is look for 3D models or 3D anatomy models on Sketchfab or ArtStation, and you can actually take screenshots of those models as well and see if that can help. Or probably look at anatomy videos where they actually go into like great detail on what muscles do what and how they move, how they look, and all that. So you're gonna have to do or spend some time looking for references and actually get everything done properly with the references that you now have. So I usually spend around 30 minutes or close to an hour just looking for reference images, videos, 3D models, things that I can use. If you do struggle to find the references that you do need, you can also look at other creatures or other characters that look similar to the model that you're working on. So for a frog, I just had as many frog references as possible from different kinds of frogs, or anything that looks similar, came pretty close. Then I just used those references to kind of fill in the gaps. I usually do that with felines or dogs or animals that resemble humans. So there's a lot of references that you can get for human, right? There's a lot of anatomy references, echo shades you could probably download and take a look at. So I tend to take the references that I have of humans, for example, and then I stretch the proportions, I move them around. I actually rig the entire character and then try and pose it to that animal that I'm currently sculpting. Like a kangaroo, for example, I stretch out the arms a little bit, I stretch out the legs, and then I try to get it as close to the kangaroo's proportions as possible, and then I just kind of copy the anatomy from the human. But this method is not, I don't recommend it always, because you're just using this to fill in the gaps, just only small gaps. It's not going to be one-to-one. And now with most of the details in the sculpt, now I'm just going in with my inflate brush and just puffing out certain muscle groups. I'm nudging everything around, I'm moving pieces or moving certain proportions around just to get it as close to the reference images that I'm using. It is actually best to puff things out in a lower level in the multi-resolution modifier, say probably a level 4 or level 5. So puff certain muscle groups out just a little bit, because if you continuously use the inflate brush in your higher levels, then it tends to sometimes cave in a little too much, and it adds some weird artifacts. Especially when you want to animate something, you will notice that there's actually mesh just going all the way deep in, so you'll just have to do a little bit more cleanup afterwards. And that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you learned something new, and I hope you enjoyed. Catch you in the next one.